Some elevators should never be used. Some lovers should never be trusted. Today, I'll tell you two scary stories of those who ignored the warnings and those who paid the price. Michael was just another university student studying late at night in the campus library. That night, at exactly 2:30 a.m., he decided to take the elevator back to his dorm. The moment the doors slid open, everything seemed normal. He stepped inside and pressed the button for the 4th floor. The elevator started moving, but as it reached the 3rd floor, it suddenly shuddered. The lights flickered off for a brief moment. In the darkness, Michael reached for the control panel, and for a split second, he felt a cold, tiny hand touch his own. The lights flickered back on, and that's when he realized he was no longer alone. In the corner of the elevator, a little girl stood with her back turned to him. Michael froze. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. What was a little girl doing in the campus library at this hour? Her long, tangled hair covered most of her shoulders. She wore an old white dress, torn at the edges. Her bare feet stood motionless on the cold elevator floor. Taking a deep breath, Michael swallowed his fear and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, little girl, are you lost? Do you need help?" For a long moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, ever so slowly, she turned her head toward him. Michael felt his stomach drop. Her face was pale, her lips cracked. But the worst part, she had no eyes. Just two dark, hollow voids. "I'm stuck here," she whispered. "Can you help me?" Michael's hand shook as he slammed his finger onto the emergency call button. Nothing. He pressed it again, and again. The elevator didn't respond. And then, the elevator shuddered violently and started moving again. But not up. It was going down. Michael's gaze snapped to the floor indicator. 4, 3, 2, 1, -1, -2, -3. His breath caught in his throat. The numbers were reversing. The elevator was descending into a place that didn't exist. 10, 11, 12. Then suddenly, it stopped. A moment of pure silence. Then, the doors slid open, and beyond them was nothing. No floor, no room, just a never-ending abyss. The void stretched endlessly before him, an infinite expanse of darkness. Michael's entire body went cold, and in that moment, the girl whipped her head around and let out a deafening, inhuman scream. Michael stumbled backward. Her face was distorting, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, her empty sockets spinning into spirals of endless blackness. She stepped toward him. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. Then, the elevator shuddered once more. The lights cut out. Michael could hear his own breath, ragged and terrified. Then, the lights flickered back on. The elevator doors slid open, and he was on the 4th floor. Everything looked normal. The girl was gone. Shaking, Michael bolted out of the elevator. The moment he stepped out, the doors slammed shut behind him. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind reeling from what had just happened. But then, he felt something cold on his back. Slowly, trembling, he reached up, and when he touched his skin, there was a tiny handprint. Michael couldn't sleep that night. The next day, he told his friends what had happened. Nobody believed him. They said he must have been too tired, too stressed, that maybe it was a hallucination. But then, one of his friends pulled up an old newspaper article. 10 years ago, a little girl went missing in the campus elevator. Her body was never found. And the most terrifying part? The description of the girl matched her exactly. Mateusz was a 29-year-old man living in Warsaw. When he met Karolina on a dating app, he had no idea that spending a weekend with her would change his life forever. Karolina loved nature. She was passionate about art and carried an air of mystery around her. Her words were mesmerizing, and soon she convinced Mateusz to join her for a weekend getaway in an isolated cabin deep in the mountains outside of Krakow. But when they stepped into that cabin, they didn't hear the whispers behind the door. The cabin was old, but surprisingly well maintained. Above the door, carved into the wood, were strange symbols. Mateusz asked Karolina about them. "Just old decorations." She smiled, but something gnawed at him. The moment he stepped inside, he felt something was off. That first night, as he lay in bed, ready to sleep, he heard whispers. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the whispers slowly took shape. "Mateusz! Mateusz! Run!" His eyes snapped open. The room was dark. Beside him, Karolina was still asleep, but the whispers were inside the room, and for a brief moment, he saw two glowing white eyes hanging from the ceiling. The second night, Mateusz looked into the mirror, and he froze. Karolina was lying in bed, facing him. But in the mirror, she wasn't there. Her reflection was missing. Mateusz's heart pounded. And then, the mirror trembled. He watched in horror as a figure emerged from the glass. It looked like Karolina, but her skin was rotting. Her eyes, pitch black voids. Mateusz turned his gaze toward Karolina. She was still asleep, but the thing in the mirror was stepping toward him. Mateusz shut his eyes, and then a cold breath brushed against his neck. "You shouldn't be here." Mateusz stayed awake until dawn. When the first light entered the cabin, he decided to search the house. Inside an old drawer, he found a yellowed newspaper. "Young woman found dead in a mountain cabin." And the picture, it was Karolina. But the newspaper was dated 15 years ago. Mateusz's hands trembled. This was impossible. And then the door creaked open. Karolina stood in the doorway, but her face had changed. Her skin had turned grey, her eyes bottomless pits of darkness. And in that moment, Mateusz realized Karolina had died 15 years ago, and this cabin had been abandoned ever since. Mateusz bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The windows were nailed shut. And then, the floor began to shake. The ceiling started collapsing. The ground beneath him felt like it was disappearing. Karolina stepped forward, but she wasn't walking, she was floating. Mateusz ran for the stairs, and as he did, he heard something rushing behind him. With one final breath, he leapt down the staircase, but something caught him in mid-air. An invisible force lifted him high and slammed him down onto the floor. Mateusz screamed in agony because a crushing pressure spread across his back, and then his spine snapped. Everything went silent. Mateusz's body no longer belonged to him. He couldn't move. Karolina knelt beside him, her black, soulless eyes glowing. She leaned in and whispered, "Just like me. Now, you'll stay here forever." 3 months later, the police found Mateusz deep in the forest, miles away from the abandoned cabin. His body broken, his spine completely shattered. When he woke up in the hospital, he didn't remember a thing, but at night, in the dark corners of his room, he still heard the whispers. "Come back, Mateusz. We're still here." And from that day forward, he was bound to a wheelchair. Karolina's presence had changed his life forever. But the most terrifying truth, no one who went searching for that cabin ever found a single trace of it.